So, with that, I guess we'll move into the next one. So, the first presentation that we talked about this morning, or that I talked about this morning, obviously was focused on aging. Is there anybody in the room now that wasn't in the room this morning during my first presentation? Okay. So, quick overview. The data that I did, that we talked about in the first presentation, was based on EREMI, a product of Regional Economic Models Incorporated, it's a population projections product. We're going to be focusing on that same population projections product at the county level in this presentation with some supplements that we've done at CEIC. So the base data that you're going to see here comes from EREMI, which is what I talked about earlier. So it's all kind of the same basket of goods we were talking about, their projections, forecasts out to 2060. So with that, what are we going to talk about in this session? A little bit of a geographic overview. This is going to be a little redundant for most of us, but I gave this as a WebEx to a national audience, and I figured it was pertinent to tell people that this is Montana, and yes, we are a state, and kind of geographically speaking, where we're at. So anyway, I kept it in here because there's some cool pictures and stuff. And then a brief demographic overview, because one of the underlying premises that I want to hit home in this presentation is the idea of relative, right? We always talk about percentage growth, and the growth is booming and things like that. And we're really talking about those things. Are we talking about nominal numbers, or are we talking about relative numbers like percentages? And when we talk about things like percentages, that underlying nominal number or actual total is important, because it doesn't take as many people or increase in nominally speaking to increase percentage when you've got small numbers. So I'll go into greater detail on that, but just a little bit of demographic overview of the state, so we kind of put that into context. Some recent activity in the region in eastern Montana. Some components, development of the Bakken oil play in western North Dakota as well as eastern Montana. And then some recent historic population. We're going to look at the population in the region, kind of what has happened in the area in eastern Montana over the last 20 years. Again, it's that same time component we had in the first presentation, 1990 to 2010, 2011 forward projections. And we're going to look at why purely historic-based modeling just doesn't appear to make sense. And we'll see that when we start looking at some of the historic population figures. And then what do we do about it? And this kind of gets into the meat of this presentation and the work that we did working with MDT as well as the EREMI population projections. So, here's Montana. Canada, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Idaho, Helena, that's where we're at. I'm assuming everyone in this room knows where this is, geographically speaking. Just south of China, right? So, this is looking at population by county. This is from the 2010 census. Again, I put some of this stuff in here for the national audience. But you look at, and these numbers are very hard to see, but the point I wanted to make here is that the largest city in Montana, is Billings, right, with 104,000 people. And so when you put that into context with places like LA, which is considered a city, Chicago, considered a city, New York, considered a city, Montana, we are small potatoes, right? And I just want to hit this home because we're dealing with, relatively speaking, small numbers, even on our high end. Now, getting into eastern Montana, the area that we're concerned with, we're dealing with even smaller numbers, right? Gallatin County, we've got 89,000 people in 2010, where Petroleum County is 494 people for the entire county, right? So just keep that in the back of your head. The area that we're dealing with is it's a fairly big geographic area with not a ton of people, relatively speaking.
When the population in Petroleum County changes, they send us an email.
Is that from the person that moved in?
Yeah. Exactly. So this is the same map, but it's a population density, and this just kind of hits that home, right? Gallatin County, person per square mile, is 34.4 people per square mile. Lewis and Clark County, 18.3. Missoula, 42.1. Yellowstone County, the most dense populated county, 56.2 people per square mile. Petroleum County, 0.3 people per square mile, and 55 cows per square mile. Don't quote me on that, I don't know. But again, all of these counties in eastern Montana, the urban, quote, epicenter, Roosevelt County, Richland was Sydney, 4.7 people per square mile, right? We're talking about small nominal numbers. So, a little bit of overview of the region, right? Why are we here? Why are we even talking about eastern Montana population? Why is it important? Well, the Williston Basin is a large, insert geographic word, I can't even pronounce that, basin in eastern Montana, western North Dakota, and southern Saskatchewan, and it's known for its rich deposits of Bakken, right? Or of oil. The Bakken Formation is a shale formation within the Williston Basin. This took me a while to figure out, looking at this in two dimension. The Bakken is within the Williston, and when you talk about these different plays, it's all about depth, right? These shale plays, the Bakken may be here and the Three Forks may be here, and it's all about depth, it's up and down, and it's kind of hard to conceptualize with the 2D map. But that's what, when you hear about people talking about these plays, the Williston Basin is the basin geographically speaking. They talk about it, covering the areas, but it's also going down into the ground, and within that, down into the ground, is the Bakken Shale Formation. So anyway, this is the same kind of, this is maps from the USGS Geological Survey. In 2008, the USGS reported an estimated 3.65 billion barrels of recoverable oil just in the North Dakota and Montana portion of the Bakken. The blue line here, this is the whole Williston Basin, the Three Forks, or the Williston Basin. This is the Bakken Lodgepole Play, the blue area. Just in those two areas, not including the Canadian portion, 3.65 barrels of recoverable oil. Now, in 1995, USGS did an estimate of the same area, and they estimated only 151 million barrels, right? And so that is huge. And in 2012 or 2013, I believe that estimate has increased. And this is USGS. If you talk to just about any private producer in the oil industry, they'll say that this is low. Everybody in the industry says that USGS is way low, way off the mark. So basically the point is there is a lot of oil in the ground out there. And this is at current technology, right? If technology gets better, you're going to be able to pull more oil out. So what is that technology that they're doing? It's hydraulic fracturing. So in difference between what has been done to get at these shale plays and what has conventionally been done for oil drilling is a conventional oil well is vertical. You basically take a drill and you drill straight down, you stick a straw in a pool of oil and you suck it up to the top. The difference between that and the shale plays is the oil is actually within rock. It's within shale. It's in these little tiny seams. And so what they do is they drill down with amazing precision, which just blows my mind. They drill down a few miles, and then they turn that drill bit 90 degrees and they drill over a few miles. And they can hit a mark within, inches or feet. It's just phenomenal. And then what they do is they blast a bunch of sand and water chemicals and stuff. I'm not exactly sure, but essentially it perforates, it creates kind of an explosion. That's the fracking part of it. And it expands that shale. It takes those crevices with the oil in it and makes them bigger. And then the pressure of the earth then makes that oil come out to the sleeve or to the oil pipe here, and then they pump it to the surface. And what has been a recent development, not a recent development, but what they've been starting to do is they'll drill these all the way down, and they won't frack this all at once. They'll frack the end first, pull that oil out, then when it's done producing, they'll cap it, they'll frack the next section, pull that oil out, cap it, and so they're becoming a lot more productive on one well. Anyway, the technology is just phenomenal. Just moving from vertical drilling to horizontal drilling has been phenomenal, but the technology advances that they've had in horizontal drilling is incredible. Again, I'm not an expert, but it's pretty cool stuff. So anyway, this is North Dakota's oil production. This comes from the Board of Mineral Resources in North Dakota. And I just want to show this point that oil production is incredible. This is the same graph. This is daily oil production. This is similar to the monthly oil production graph we saw on our website that Mary showed. But the green line is oil production, and it's just skyrocketing in North Dakota. These are those graphs just screenshotted off of our website. Rotary rig counts in the blue line and the red line for oil production. This is monthly oil production. And I just wanted to show and make the point, the North Dakota barrels of oil, or North Dakota, in July, they were producing 27.1 million barrels of oil every month. In Montana, we're producing a lot of oil, but it's a tenth almost 2.58 million barrels of oil.
And that's statewide, Joe?
This is statewide, right? And so this is not just Bakken specific, but Bakken is the majority play in both of these states. So they're really good proxies. I just want to make the point that there's oil development in eastern Montana, but the oil development is in North Dakota. So that's something to keep in mind. This is hitting home to that prior point. This is just a satellite view at night of western North Dakota and eastern Montana. And as you can see, some of this is flare gas. When they drill down, I believe the Bakken is 65% oil, 35% gas. Or like the Marcellus shale play in Pennsylvania, they're doing horizontal drilling and fracturing exactly very similar to the same way that they're doing in the Bakken, but it's more gas than it is oil. And so they're horizontal, they're doing development on natural gas versus oil, where the Bakken, they're primarily focused with oil and gas comes out as a byproduct. They are capturing a lot of it, but a lot of it currently is just being flared. It comes out of the ground, they light it on fire and just let it go. That's trying to be mitigated, but from a light perspective at night, a big gas flare becomes very, very bright. But a lot of these are gas flares, but also a lot of them are just well activity. These are oil pads. And so as you can see, there is some activity in Montana. Some of these are cities like Sydney, but there is some oil wells. But the bulk of this oil development is west of us, or east of us, excuse me, in western North Dakota. So the region that we're specifically looking at, this is the 16 county region that we're going to be focused on. Now, I've gotten plenty of calls saying, why didn't you include Treasure and why'd you include Phillips? Or there's a huge impact in Billings that isn't included in this. And all of those arguments are absolutely factual. The reason why we chose to define our region as this 16 county region is because this is the region that's defined by the Montana Department of Transportation in their Region 4. And as you will see in this, later in this presentation, the work that we did to do supplemental population projections based on oil development in the region is based off of work that MDT did. And they did it on this 16 county area. And so therefore, from a study or from a merging data comparability, we chose this same region. So this is the data sources, same slide we saw before. Base data from EREMI at the county level, figures from 90 to 2010 are historic, 2011 on are projected, and they're not census data, right? The 90 to 2010 is not census, it's estimates. So there's a bunch of tables and graphs that are coming up, and they're hard to read. If you want some very specifics, all this is going to be on our website. You can download this and look at it at a county-specific level, but there's just a few points that I want to make overarching based on these, so I'm going to go through these kind of quickly. So I apologize for not being able to see them. But this is getting back to that point. Nominally speaking, we're dealing with a very small population figures, right? Total, the 16 county area in 1990 is 86,000 people, right? We were looking at 790,000 people in the state in 1990. 86,000 of them live in a third of the state. And so very small population numbers. So getting back to that idea of relative, right? Fastest growing, stuff like that. The statement can be made that between 2010 and 2012, Richland County, Montana was the 6th fastest growing county in the U.S. of all counties with at least 10,000 people. Right? That's pretty phenomenal. That's a product of 1,064 people. Right? It only took 1,000 people to get a 10% increase because Richland County in 2012, based on their estimates, was just over 10,000 people. So I just want to put that in perspective. I am not downplaying that the impacts that are happening out there are very real to the people that are living there. I just want to make the point that when you're dealing with percentage and relative terms and fastest growing and this kind of stuff, you need to kind of take into consideration what are the nominal figures behind that. That's just the point I want to make. So, historic total population change within these 16 counties. From 1990 to 2000, there's an average annual decrease of 0.73% for all these counties. All of them throughout this decade, we're seeing between just under 1 to almost 2% negative decline. Again, percentage, so not very big figures, but we're seeing negative decline in the area. 2000 to 2010, that slows off a little bit, 0.29%, but it's still negative. We're seeing negative growth in that area. If you add those 2 decades together and normalize it, you're looking at about a 0.5% year-over-year decline in total population for the area. And that's what has been happening historically, 1990 to 2010. this is that same table in graph form. These are just all stacked, the 16 counties, their share, proportional share of the total population. And as you see from 1990, a gradual decline. And you see a little bit of a bump in 2008, 9, and 10, which we all know is probably a product of early stages of Bakken development. So, historically, growth in the region has been negative. Will that continue? And why do we care, right? So, first of all, why do we care? Well, for a lot of the same reasons we were talking about earlier when we were talking about aging population, we're talking about some of the same things with just population. Infrastructure investment, right? If I'm Northwestern Energy, am I going to invest a bunch of money in bolstering my power transmission lines out to some of these places? Do we think that there's going to be a substantial demand in the future to substantiate or to subsidize some of these huge investment projects? Water, wastewater treatment utilities, transportation, like MDT was worried about. You know, are roads large enough? Are they going to maintain capacity? Are bridges big enough? Should we pave some roads? Should we, build new roads and bypasses, things like that? Also, service investment, police protection. How many more fire departments should we build? Should we build any more? Should we expand? Should we add EMT services, healthcare services, and then obviously a whole host of other things? These are all investment things that we don't want to do for now. We want to do for the population that's here today, but they're also things that we need to have for 20 or 30 years from now. We're not building for just today's population, we're building for the future. And so that's why it's important to get some sort of metric or some sort of estimate on what we believe total population may be in these areas looking ahead. So, in short, the historic decline in population within the region is a product of not enough working age population, backfilling the existing population that are growing age in place and essentially dying off. So if we look purely at historic population, basically you put these population figures in Excel and drag them out, from a model-based, purely model or estimate, data-driven model-based estimate would project eastern Montana to continue in a downward tailspin into the indefinite future. This is the point that I was making during my previous presentation with those other three companies. They just hadn't at the time taken into consideration the realities that are happening in this region in recent years and what's going to happen. And so because of that, when you take the last 10 or 20 years of population and you stick it in a model and you hit go, that model is going to estimate decline. And we just know that's not going to happen because of oil, right? We know that's not going to happen. So it's just a little bit closer to home. Again, talking about not a huge number of people, but when you're talking about a town of 150 going to 450 people in just a few years, that's huge, right? That's like over 300% increase. I understand the percentage again, relative terms, but if you're one of those 150 folks living out there, you get another 300 people moving in, that's big.
And that's people moving in, Joe, not in that, you said that these
Right.
are big residents coming in to relocate there, not just these people working there. So the impacts in all these communities are magnified by the fact you have workers that are coming in. We have folks right now that are working in the Bakken that take the train back to Kalispell. Work 4 days, go back and take the train back to Kalispell where they live.
Right, and that's a good point, and I want to address that too. Like I said earlier, is these numbers are estimates of resident population, people that claim permanent residency or the majority of the year living within the respective county or area. And so the numbers that we'll see here in a minute are representative or they're estimates based on that definition, not people that live in Wyoming and work 2 weeks on and drive up and back every 2 weeks. People that live in western Montana and drive back and forth, they got their families back outside of the region. So that's something to take into consideration, and we'll address that towards the end of the presentation with some of the downfalls from these things. So again, this is the same idea. How do you predict population, right? Births and deaths are relatively straightforward, getting back to what we were talking about earlier. But it's this net migration, which tends to be the sticking point in all population projections. And especially in eastern Montana, when we don't really have historic trends that are going to mirror, or our future trends we don't think are going to mirror what happened historically. And so that's where migration is a real sticking point in these model-based estimates. So this is what EREMI is saying. This is what, when we purchased EREMI, we sent them a check. They gave us a password and login to the server, and this is the data that we downloaded. This is the data that we were looking at for the state earlier in the aging population. This is broken down for the 16 counties. What EREMI is projecting for total population in the area. 2015, 2020, 25, looking out to 2040, we're seeing 83,700 people in 2015, 87,735, 90, 91, and then steadily kind of leveling off and decreasing after 23, 2035. But what we're seeing is positive growth, right? The last 10 years were negative, though it was mitigated a little bit in the last 20 years, excuse me, from 2000 to 2010, it was slower, it was still negative. But what we're seeing is REMI, with the exclusion of one of these counties, which is very small, Phillips County, all of these are positive figures, right? Which is great, because we don't know exactly what these numbers are, but we know they're not negative. And so essentially what this is telling us is that REMI looked at more than just the historic figures. Right? They looked at more of just what was happening, and they looked at what is happening now and try to project that forward. So this is that population graph looking forward 2011 and 2040, and we see an increase. That line is where historic estimates were, and in the left and on the right is where the population projections go forward. And we see that increase across all the counties. So this is great, right? I mean, EREMI's managed to project population figures for all 16 eastern Montana counties, predicting growth over the next 10 to 15 years despite historic trends. So how'd they do that? Economic in-migration. That's what this is. We've got an older population, it's growing age and passing away in place. You don't necessarily historically have a younger population coming into backfill, so then they're not bringing in children or having children. The majority drive in this region is economic in-migration. And it's due primarily to development in the oil fields. Not just and this gets back to the point we talked about, residency. The oil wells in North Dakota sometimes are feet from the Montana border. So if you live in Sydney, but you're still working in North Dakota, you're counted as a Sydney resident in these estimates and impact to local communities and things like that. And so that's why I showed some of that North Dakota stuff, is just because we're not seeing the impact and the actual oil development on our side of the border does not mean that we're not seeing a substantial impact in things like population. People are choosing to live on this side of the border even though they may be employed on the other side of the border.
And why is that?
Whole host of reasons. Maybe you were born and raised in Montana, you want to stay in Montana. Maybe your spouse could find a job in Montana or in Sydney or this small town. Maybe you used to live in Billings, and so you decided to live in Sydney instead of Williston. Williston's going crazy, right? And so eastern Montana is going crazy in its own respect, but it's less crazy than the epicenter that is in North Dakota. And so if you think about kind of periphery, you could almost think about some of these communities in Montana as suburbs of the Williston area, right? And so maybe they just do. Whole host of different reasons.
Housing too.
Right.
Yeah. There's
Exactly.
nothing in Williston, but it's affordable for a lot of folks.
Right.
And you need to be actually closer to work, too.
And that's exactly right. And they may be closer, right? Williston, if you look back over there, may have been 30 miles away, and Sydney could have been 10 from wherever their, paths that they're generally servicing or working on. It could be closer. But a lot of times, and that's something that's interesting, Montanans, the more rural you get, and this isn't just a Montana thing, people find this really weird. You talk to someone from the city and they say, I've got a 2-hour commute, but I go 8 miles. And it's like, well, I got a half-hour commute and I go 40. And that's a difference in mentality. People, generally speaking, in rural areas don't have an issue with driving further distances. And so someone moving from a city may look at an 80-mile commute as a big deal, and so they're going to want to be closer to where they're at, where other people may not really view that as a big deal, and they'd rather live in a certain town because their family, they feel like it's a better place for their family or something like that. There's different decisions that drive that. Just a side point. So, moving into why we're here on this one. Why can't we just be happy with the EREMI projections? Right? They're great. They projected growth instead of decline. Why can't we just roll with those? Well, 2 reasons. One, there's a lot of uncertainty around future oil development trends, both in eastern Montana and western North Dakota. And because of that, that uncertainty in oil development is going to undoubtedly create uncertainty around population. The oil industry, both the direct industry and the service-related industries, are heavily reliant on people. It's a highly labor-intensive, at least during the development stage. So the more oil development you have, the more people you demand to get those things going. There's a whole time horizon of oil development to production to reclamation, but we're not going to get into that today. And the other thing is the Montana Department of Transportation already had estimated total population figures based on the oil production scenarios. PI Plus is a REMI product we were talking about earlier, the structural models, the interactive models that REMI creates. MDT, one of them is called a PI Plus model. And MDT has, for Region 4, they have one for all 5 regions, their transportation regions in the state. They used REMI to look at potential impacts to infrastructure in the eastern part of the state based on oil development. So the Planning Division, Region 5, has a 5-region PI Plus model, that's what I was just talking about. And they looked at the estimated impacts to Montana transportation infrastructure if, that's a big if, future oil development increased to varying levels of production within the state. Right, so the approach that they took on this was not, this is what we think oil development's going to do, because, besides being highly controversial and political, if they were good at that, they'd be working for some oil company or something else. They wouldn't be doing it. So instead of taking the stance of this is what we think is going to happen with the oil industry and oil development, they said, okay, let's look what am I thinking of? Within the ground, geography, whatever, rocks.
Geology.
Geology, thank you. Geologically speaking. Geez, all these geos. Geologically speaking, and say, all right, this is how much oil's there. This is the percentage that's in the recoverable areas. And then they started looking, they backed it out and said, all right, if oil development went to, if every man, woman, and child and their dog went into the Bakken region and tried to develop every barrel of recoverable oil today, this is how many wells it could sustain, and each well demands this many people for so many months. And they did sort of a backwards analysis to back out the population and socioeconomic impacts, which then they related to vehicle miles traveled from the data that they have to look at infrastructure. So this is a graph similar to the one used by MDT when they did this work. They did their work over a year ago. It was last summer. And I just wanted to show this graph. This is from the North Dakota Board of Oil and Gas. And they did this about a year and a half ago. I believe it was January. Yeah, a year and a half ago. And they said, all right, this is where we're at now. This is in North Dakota, the proven oil production. This is probably what we think oil production is going to do in North Dakota. And this is definitely possible. And so this is what MDT framed their work around, is this idea of, okay, here's proven, here's probably what's going to happen, or what Board of Oil and Gas is thinking for North Dakota, but here's possible. Possible being, this is everything that you can get out of the ground. That's what's there with today's technology. And to make this point, I just wanted to show that, remember we saw this back a bit ago, a few slides ago. In July, North Dakota was producing 876,000 barrels of oil per day. That's up here. That's going up to this possible. Right? Again, we're focusing on North Dakota because North Dakota has some really good data, but also if we're looking at population in Montana, like I said, the oil development isn't necessarily in Montana. It's in North Dakota, but that impact is having an impact on the population within the state. And the North Dakota effect, quote unquote, is something that was incorporated in MDT's study, looking at what the effect of the oil development on the other side of the border is going to have on Montana's population. So that was something that was factored in. So 4 scenarios of how future oil development may look in eastern Montana, and use their REMI, their PI Plus model, to estimate the impacts for the eastern Montana region. That whole region as a whole, they've got 5 models, one for each of those regions. So it's not county specific, it's for that entire region for eastern Montana. And they're mostly concerned with transportation infrastructure. So I wasn't involved in the analysis, so I don't have a totally comprehensive understanding of this, but I do know the people that did it, and they're excellent researchers, analysts and researchers. And just last week, MDT released this study, and you can go to this website, terribly long link, and you can read the study itself. It's like a 30-page document that goes into detail their methodology and how they did what they did. But basically what we did is we said, great, you guys did good work, thanks for doing that for the last 6 months, give us your population stuff. So on the back end of their study, they spit out over the time period of their study, which was 2012 to 2035, the back end came out on these 4 levels of oil production. If oil production is basically drops off to if every man, woman, and child goes in to get oil out of the ground that's available. And then 2 scenarios, a medium high and a medium low. If those 4 scenarios happen, what does that do to population in the whole region? And these are those lines. The top one is if every bit of oil that's estimated that's recoverable is gone after, this is the total population over the next 25 years.
For those 16 counties.
For those 16 counties in aggregate. And medium-high oil production is very similar. Low oil production is basically no oil production, but you'll still see an increase in total population, which kind of gives credence to, even though there may not be any oil development in Montana, there's still oil development in North Dakota, and we're still seeing people because of it. But this medium-low, which is kind of business as usual, what we've been seeing as far as oil development in the state, kind of, it's not falling off, but it's not necessarily going gangbusters like North Dakota. If you take EREMI, the product that we have, take all 16 counties, add them up, put them on a graph, and then you take the output that MDT produced based on that medium-low level of oil production, those population figures almost mirror one another, which is pretty incredible, right? So that's what it's saying is, MDT saying, all right, kind of business as usual, this is what oil development, if oil development is kind of going business as usual, here's what the population is going to be. And so what that says is it lends credence to REMI, that they went in and said, okay, this is kind of what oil development's doing, this is what we think is going to happen at the county level for population based on business as usual oil development. You add those together, they mirror one another. It's pretty cool that those 2 different projects come together.
Thank God.
Right? So anyway, we've got that. So now we're like, sweet, right? So we've got these 2 population trends based on higher levels or heightened levels of oil development in eastern Montana, but it's just for the whole state, or that whole region, excuse me, that 16 county region. So that's what we want to do with say, all right, so how can we bring this down and allocate it out to the 16 different counties, right? So we can get some sort of county estimate of total population over this time period based on these assumed heightened levels of oil development. So that's kind of the whole goal here, is to allocate the difference between the total population for the region projected by MDT's oil scenario analysis, medium high and high, between kind of quote unquote the baseline or the status quo that EREMI projects, which is right here. So for every year, this total population difference for the region, we want to try and allocate that out 16 different ways to 16 different counties so we can get a county-specific population trend based on this high level of oil development. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So a couple of considerations that we did. So it's kind of it's a fairly straightforward calculation. It's fairly simplistic, and I'll get into why we did that at the end. But a couple of considerations that we felt were important. So each of the 16 counties that make up the region, the eastern Montana area, differ in their overall size, right? Obviously. Some of them are bigger than others, population-wise, than others. And so therefore, the total population of the region, as estimated by EREMI, which is what we have at the county level, can be thought of as the total population for the region is the disproportionate sum of all 16 of those counties, right? So it's not a complete perfect spread of total population across those counties. They're disproportionately some of the largest and the bigger.
Yeah, Fallon County gets more into it than Phillips County, for example.
Right. And the second consideration is to account for the relative magnitude, right? Because what we're looking at is the total population. And so in order to allocate it out, we need some sort of share. And so what we assumed is, all right, well, if the county's share, the county's total population as a share of the region differ across the region as well, right? So you got total population and you also got a share of the region. And so of the 16 counties with respect to the region as a whole in year T, the share of each county's total population of the region is used as a weight for allocation. So essentially, the county's population, as EREMI estimates it or projects it in time T or in year T, divided by the total population area. So here's the total population, and then what's the county share? And so essentially, if you add up all 16 of those county shares, it equals 1.
So Fallon County might be 20% or 10%.
or less, right? But yeah, but like Sheridan County is going to get a higher share because they've got about 10,000 people in 2010 versus say Phillips County or some of the smaller counties, proportionally speaking. So this is the final functional form. By using a weighting factor based on each county's proportional share of the region, the total population in each year, so we didn't have a base year and project forward, we used each year as a base year. Differences in growth trends between counties relative to the overall growth of the region are implicitly accounted for over time. So obviously all we're doing here is assuming that EREMI got it right as far as growth or relative change year to year by county, right? Because that's all we're doing is we're just taking a lump sum and allocating it out based on the proportional share and some growth over time. So here are the results. Again, tables, graphs, but I just wanted to make a couple of overarching points. This will all be available online, and it is available online. But from EREMI, the baseline, we're looking at from 2012 to 2020, that 8-year period, an average annual growth in the region of 1.1%. If you look at the medium-high oil development, so that wasn't the top curve, but the one just below that, we're looking at about 2.8% growth in the region. And this is broken out by the different counties. This is that in graphics form. The blue is EREMI, the baseline. The red is the medium-high, and the green is the high. And you'll notice the red and the green are fairly similar, but that's how they're very similar in the overall population for the region as a whole. You'll notice, take into consideration, or notice here that the larger areas, this is Custer County, they're getting 3,500 people, that overall share between this time, 2012 to 2020. Dawson County is getting quite a few. Fallon County is also getting quite a few. Richland and Roosevelt County, as well as Vallon County. All of them are getting a share because that's a product of the equation. But all of these counties were indeed growing, and so therefore they did get a little bit. Get into that a little bit at the end here. So this is just from 2012 to 2030. Similar things, EREMI, medium, high, high. And all it's showing is from the medium, high to high, it's still an increased growth over the baseline, but because you add in those last couple of years where it starts to peter off and start declining again, you normalize or bring down that average annual yearly change. And this is that again, fairly similar graph. Custer County, Dawson County, Fallon County, Richland County, Roosevelt County are getting the lion's share of the population. And this is just from 2012 to 2035, the total extent of the study that MDT did. So, in summary, are these perfect? Of course not, right? I did them. So, there definitely appears to be a bias of over-allocation to more populated counties. But I would argue that if you're going to say that increased growth is going to happen in the region, you could make the argument that that growth is going to be centered around already urban areas or these larger counties. If I'm an oil company and I'm going to put a subsidiary office in, I'm not going to go to a town of 50 people probably. I'm going to go to a town like Sydney or Miles City or Glendive because they've already got certain public infrastructure things in place, services, infrastructure, roads, things like that.
And private.
What's that?
And private. I want to go where there's a McDonald's. I'm not going to go because
Right.
workers want McDonald's.
Exactly. And so you can definitely, I would make the argument that if we are going to see this heightened level of growth, a lot of it will be polarized around these already established urban areas. Now, again, we're talking about resident population, right? You hear these stories that are very factual and very true. If the XL Keystone Pipeline gets passed, there will be a 2,000 person man camp that will move into Baker, right? That's very true. But those are migrant workers. They'll be there for 6 months. Those are not in these projections. That goes away from this assumption that it will be polarized in an urban area. But those are different things that are definitely happening and are realities, but they're more of a transient, short-term kind of impact that are big impacts, but are not necessarily captured in the numbers that are presented here. So keep that into consideration as well. And also no more detail on demographic characteristics, right? Like we saw earlier, and we talked about on the website, EREMI we do have at the county level by age, by gender. But the figure that came out from MDT is total population. Think about what we're doing here. EREMI is a projection, it's an estimate, they don't have a crystal ball. MDT's doing their study based on a whole host of estimates and assumptions. And then we're merging that to create some more estimates and assumptions of what population may do. So you could argue that the more granulated that you get, or the more level of detail, is actually going to provide you no more information that's reliable, in my opinion. So total population is all we have. So the takeaway. What you take away from these? The supplementary total population projections provide some insight into potential trends that may be realized over the next few years if the development does accelerate in eastern Montana. So what I would argue is, you look at these things on a nominal basis, and it's, we can argue over whether it's going to be 5,800 more people or 6,200 more people. Well, 400 people trying to project 20 years from now, that's really darn difficult, right? But we can at least look at, all right, if oil development is kind of doing this, and we expect it to do this, or we expect it to do this, at least we can look at what we've got now, and on a relative or proportional basis, think about what we can expect as far as a total population, at least by kind of two extremes. It's kind of the way to look at it. And just getting back to that point, these, like most other population figures that are reported, quantify resident population only. So that transient impact, even though I'm not living there and I'm not reporting my permanent residence in Sydney, I'm moving there for living in a man can for 2 weeks and coming out, or living in an apartment for 2 weeks and then leaving back to my family in Billings or Wyoming or wherever. They're not reported here, they're not quantified here, but the impacts that someone that's there for 2 weeks versus someone that's there for 2 weeks and then the next 2 weeks because they're residents, they have the same impacts. So from a local standpoint, the impacts that are felt by someone that's transitory versus not are not dissimilar, but they're just not captured in the total number of people on the ground. So that's one thing that I want to caution is, from a total impact standpoint of boots on the ground, so to speak, these are conservative figures. Even at the heightened levels of oil development, if you believe that's what's going to happen in the state, they're still conservative figures. And with that, open it up for some questions, criticisms.
Yeah, the other thing I would note is that this is why I don't want Joe regurgitating numbers, because he's such a great analyst. But if you don't agree with our methodology or anything else, at least we've posted it all. It's out on the website. You can read the paper. You can see why we chose what we did. So if you guys have other ideas, better ideas, we're welcome to listen. I don't know that we'll change things, but we're welcome to listen. So.
Yeah.
Do you know what the general demographics are of the Bakken workers?
Anecdotally, young and male.
But you don't
I don't
have
have any
anything about
quantifiable.
family?
No. We don't. See, and that's where the real need, and that's a lot of the feedback that I've gotten on these is, hi, I live in eastern Montana. I appreciate you doing this because there's no other figures like this available for our area, but they're too low. And I completely respect that opinion. And a lot of it is because of the resident versus transient. And when you're walking downtown, you don't know who's only there for 2 weeks and who's claiming residency there. And so you feel the impacts is a lot more heightened or a lot higher than
Has
some
the
of these other
employer
areas.
offered anything?
No, we haven't pursued anything like that. What's that?
They're transient too.
They are, right, exactly. And so because of that, the lack of data is a huge issue. It is, right? These towns, historically, that haven't had to make a growth plan because, let's face it, they didn't have growth. Now, they haven't done these in 50 years, now they're forced to do one, and they got to do it fast, and they got to do it, way beyond the scope. They're doing it like Billings has been doing it for years, but they've never had to do one. They kind of went from A to Z on this whole process. And then on top of that, they don't really have good figures or numbers or anything as a starting point to even try and think about this stuff. So data issues are huge in this part of the state. It's a rural issue.
A lot of the towns have to notify everybody of something. And they have all these trailer parks that are just really temporary, and they have to figure out how can we get to everybody.
Propane hookups.
The propane distributor.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, really?
So when you went in and got your propane, you got the notice.
Right. Which is an out-of-the-box way to think about stuff, right? I mean, which is completely necessary. This, even we talk about the most currently available data, it's always at least a year old, right? Unless it's like unemployment data, which may be monthly. But census data, if it's a year old, it's brand spanking new out of the box, right? And what happened a year ago in these areas is old news. It was old news 11 and a half months ago. And so that's where this whole data, even though it's not available, the stuff that is available is not painting the correct picture of what's actually happening now. And a lot of times it's not completely quantifying what was happening a year or two ago that it's trying to paint. And so some of these local initiatives, like, trying to figure out where people are at and so you can try and count them, is really needed. And it's really amazing a lot of these people are, local areas are taking initiative to do that.
It's also the definitions, because the impact of a school teacher on a community is X, but the impact of a truck driver is 5X, because they're driving, what do they drive, like 12 hours a day?
A lot.
With these
Right.
huge trucks, and the roads just disintegrate because of the clay up there. And it's-
Right, you're absolutely right.
If you had some way to know how many truck drivers are in this county, it's going to give you some idea of how many trucks are going to be running times X, and they have to redesign the roads so much deeper now. It's very
Right.
expensive.
That was a lot of what MDT was looking at. Car travel, besides congestion, doesn't really depreciate road quality very much. It's the trucks. And especially when you've got trucks on roads that weren't designed to carry those kind of trucks, not even taking into consideration the capacity or the amount of demand that these trucks are doing. So that's what MDT was concerned about, was we've got to fix these things, but should we fix them as they were and just keep doing that? Or should we make them bigger? Should we pave them? Should we, those are the questions, because I think it's like $1 million a mile or something to just pave a 2-lane or something. Don't quote me on that, I don't know. But it is unbelievably expensive. It is unbelievably expensive, right? And like we all know, Eastern Montana, point A to point B could be 80 miles, right? But that trip might be made 5 times a day. So when you're trying to, if you've got to pave this 80 miles versus this 14 miles, that's a lot of money that you've got to make a decision with. And so that's what MDT was trying to figure out, is capacity issues, load issues, vehicle miles traveled, truck miles traveled on different corridors and things like that. It's really good work. I encourage you to go read that paper. Yeah.
I don't want to hog the floor, but has anybody done any parallel work, like when we had Colstrip in the 1970s and 90s? I know it was impacted over to Dawson County and the like, and
Sure.
booming the bus cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Have there been any studies that try to use those estimates to project, or to use those same patterns and
Right.
project currently?
No, specifically to this, no. And the argument that you'll hear is that this is a long-term deal, right? The boom and the bust patterns of historic boom towns or bust towns were 5, 10, 15, even 20 years. People are saying this is a 40, 60, 80-year thing. Whether you agree with that or not, that's kind of been the overarching argument. And so then in lieu of that, building on that argument, things that have happened in the past are not relevant because it's a different ballgame. I don't necessarily agree 100% with that, but that is an argument that's made.
And one of the big differences Joe alluded to earlier was just the advancements in technology with this fracking industry. I mean, what they've been able to do, and the rapid development of that technology and how it continues to be perfected because it's going on in so many different places is part of that. But who knows? Yeah.
Right.
And how you use and what you do with the technology of extracting the resources are very different. When you're going after oil, you're talking about a much wider spread area, whereas with coal, it's much more confined local impact. So you could actually plan for coal a hell of a lot more than you can for oil, because you've got who knows how many people are out there,
Right.
exploring.
Well, exactly. Adding to
So
that point, right? If you're a coal developer, pretty specifically how much coal is in the ground and what it's going to take you to get coal. You've been digging coal the same way for years, right? And so you know what your cost points are on it and how many people it's going to take and how long it's going to take you to do that. And so from an impact standpoint, you just plug those numbers in and you can see the impacts. Technology, again, I don't know this stat, you should look it up, but if they increase technological or the amount of recoverable barrels in the Bakken by like 1%, that extends the time horizon significantly for how long the life of the Bakken play will be. And so if you look at the technological advances just in the last 5 or 6 years in horizontal drilling, we were talking about recoverable barrels of oil. I think that's like, I don't know, I don't even want to say, but it's significantly less than 0.25% of the actual oil that's in the ground. And a lot of industry experts and analysts will say that what USGS says is maybe half or less. I don't know, again, I'm throwing out. But getting to that point, if technology changes just a little bit, it can really change the potential impacts now and into the future for these areas. And the geographic spread is just so much more diversified than like a open pit mine or something like that.
And the other way.
Right.
So, Mr. iPhone says it's noon, so we're always trying to be on time. We'll wrap it up. Thank you so much. As I indicated, there's maps in your things for lunch. I appreciate the fact that you guys, in order for us to put on this conference and do it, that you go get your own lunches, so thank you. Please, I really encourage you to come back at 1:30 and listen to Barb Wagner. She's actually going to talk about the state of the economy, and then Bruce Schwartz in the epidemiology group is going to talk about health.
Could possibly last
Please, I
over
really
80
hope
years
all of
then
you
from
come
now.
back. These will be
I'm not.
great.
That's what a lot of people are saying.